Recently, I picked up a really slim 386 computer from 1991, I'm pretty sure it's from 1991, and it's in need of a new hard disk. So let's get it working again and take a look at this really interesting computer. This is what $2.5 grand got you back in late 1990, the Mitac Mistation 3S, a rather compact desktop, otherwise known as the MI316-003-U. This machine may be slim, but it still has room for ISA expansion cards. The front looks like something straight from the 80s, lots of straight lines, a very angular design, and thankfully a 3.5-inch floppy drive, which is currently the only way I can load software onto this PC. I don't know what this means, but it's also tested and approved by Novell Labs. For a machine that's over 30 years old, the condition is pretty good. It's even got the original feet. They may have started to travel a bit over time though. Inside, it's pretty simple. Of course, missing the hard disk as the previous owner mentioned. This type of motherboard looks like it's straight out of the 80s as well. So many components you just don't see on newer boards. And half of the RAM slots are populated with memory. So let's fire it up and see what happens. Very quickly, it tells us that this is an 80386SX based system with a BIOS copyright date of 1989. It then slowly counts up the available memory, 640 kilobytes soldered to the motherboard and 3.4 megabytes populating the 4 RAM slots that we saw earlier. No boot device is apparently available, so let's go into the BIOS and remedy that. I set diskette A as 1.44 megabyte and also set the graphics to VGA. With the BIOS floppy disk drive configured, I can now try to load something into memory. What better to try than MS-DOS 6.22? Success! The system appears to at very least be able to load into DOS. This also shows that the floppy drive is indeed functional. But what drive should I install? I picked out a few that I had sitting in this cupboard for well over a decade. First of all, I thought I would try to use this 500 megabyte IDE drive, originally from an Apple computer. It's definitely one of the smaller IDE drives I own that's not already in a working machine. This time, upon startup, we got the message diskette drive 1 seek failure, meaning the system is detecting something at the very least. But when it comes to selecting the hard disk information, none of these options seem anywhere near the drive we just installed. I did, however, learn that selection option 48 or 49 allows me to input the drive information myself. Most drives will have this written on the sticker itself, but not this one though. I looked up this model online and I'm pretty sure this is the correct info. So in went the MS-DOS boot disk once again. This time I ran the program fdisk. It didn't detect a fixed drive. So let's try to determine whether the drive even works. Here's an old PC that will likely have its own video sometime this year. It definitely needs a good cleaning, and let's see if it still works. Apart from the CMOS battery being flat, it still boots straight into Windows 95. But what will happen once we put the Apple hard disk into here? With any luck, we'll confirm whether it works at the bare minimum. This newer PC has the ability to auto-detect drives, confirming that the info I've found online doesn't actually match up with this particular drive. So there are the settings I'm going to have to try and input into the Mitac's BIOS. Let's give that a try. Oh, and I also can't seem to input more than 4 digits. Guess I'll give the LBA mode a try and put in the settings with pre-compression set to 0. Fingers crossed, fdisk finally detected a drive. I then created a primary DOS partition. I then format the partition. So far, so good. This would have been a lot easier if I simply invested in a CF card to IDE drive adapter, and maybe I'll buy one for future videos. To test out the hard disk, I'll try installing MS-DOS, which I previously installed on a series of floppy disks. At the command prompt, I typed in setup, which brought me to a familiar Microsoft install screen. But oh no, as soon as the installer attempted to write files to the drive, it couldn't. I ran ScanDisk on the drive, which seemed to not find any issues, giving it a clean bill of health. So what about this Seagate drive? I put in the settings as close as I could, however the 16,383 cylinders couldn't be input due to the 4-digit limit in the BIOS. It looked as if the drive was responding to some degree, even writing files, getting as far as requiring me to insert the second MS-DOS disk. Surely this will work, right? And then an error occurred while writing to the drive sadly. And while I don't want to wipe the drive from the Hypertech PC due to it being a future video project, how about I try installing Windows 3.1 alongside 95? At least this is a drive I can input information for since each item is below 9,999. And as we can see, the Mitac is able to read the directory of the Windows 95 hard drive. So let's have a go at installing Windows 3.1. I made sure to install Windows to a different directory as to not mess up the 95 install already on there. I was able to get some way through the setup, switching to the second floppy disk. However, the rest of the Windows 3.1 setup simply didn't start, even though files did indeed copy to the hard disk itself in the specified folder. Attempting to load into the setup from the hard disk seemed promising, however it simply started the process from the beginning once again. So let's try a hard disk from a computer I know works, isn't too big for the Mitac's BIOS, and I'd be willing to wipe clean. You may remember this computer from a video I did back in 2020. It was a terrible old machine from 1997, which cleaned up pretty well in the end and is still working thankfully. I made note of the hard disk's parameters, which in this newer BIOS are auto-detected. Just to be sure, I loaded it into Windows 98, just as I left it nearly 2 years ago. In that video, I had to replace the original hard disk, which had failed, with this drive I had lying around. It's an ever-dependable 2.1GB Seagate Medalist, still going strong nearly 25 years later. And once again, I went into the BIOS, configured the hard disk, and well, I wasn't expecting it to even attempt to load into Windows 98. But of course, it didn't work as the system is not even close to reaching the minimum system requirements to run 98. It would have been pretty cool if it did work, even slowly. Now, time to once again try installing Windows 3.1 on this ancient slim PC. The Seagate hard disk was wiped, formatted, and appeared to be properly configured to run in this much older computer. I installed MS-DOS, which had an issue at the end, but it's still installed as far as I can tell, and the next hurdle was 3.1 itself. The hard disk was detected fine, copied files, and this time we got further into the install than ever before. Are our problems finally resolved? I sure hope so. Now we can type in those 3 magical letters at the DOS prompt, WIN, and away it went. I was actually cheering at this point. We now had Windows running on the Mitac after quite a few hurdles. But this machine still doesn't have sound, so I thought I'd give this ISA card a go. It was very difficult to put in as the riser card attached to the motherboard wasn't supported by anything and could very easily be snapped off. But a card like this won't do much without the correct drivers, and thankfully I was able to find them online. I then put them on a floppy disk, and in DOS it showed some of the sound card parameters. Finally we get to hear the joyful little startup sound. But why stop here? I loaded a few MIDI tunes onto a disc. Yes, you've just been rickrolled, and I'll have to turn down the output from the sound card as it is distorting a bit, but it does indeed work. Now let's disassemble the machine and give it a good cleaning. The IDE cable that connects to the hard disk doesn't appear to be the original, and I'll have to see if I can find a shorter one. I've also invested in an IDE to compact flash card reader. Let's hope it arrives sometime soon from eBay. That'll definitely save a lot of headache when it comes to requiring storage on older computers. It's all pretty simple inside of this machine. Every screw appears to be a Phillips head, and user upgradability was clearly encouraged, but I'm not sure whether these modifications to the board were here when this machine first shipped. There are some pretty long wires that are hot glued to the board for some reason. I'm definitely not going to touch them. Another quirky feature is the keyboard and mouse inputs on the right side of the case, instead of on the back like nearly every other computer I've seen. Is this a cost-saving measure? Either way, I can be thankful that the power supply is working, as I've never come across one of these in this form factor, so getting a replacement would be rather challenging. I was also very careful not to snap the large plastic on switch that extends all the way to the front. This was also likely done to lower material costs. This now reveals the model number of this board. I can also assume that it was manufactured sometime in 1990. This would have to be a very rare board by now, since it looks like it would only really work in this specific case. There's even built-in VGA. This would normally be on an ISA card, but to keep this machine slim, many parts had to be integrated into the motherboard. Oh, and here's another interesting find. The case is stamped September 18th, 1990, which is 11,620 days ago. It's good to see that the casing hasn't suffered any major corrosion, and there's only a minimal amount of dust built up in here. To be fair, I'm not sure if the previous owner had actually attempted to clean this though, and I didn't realize that this small chip here is in fact the 386SX 16MHz CPU. For some reason, I thought this chip was a lot bigger. The metal chassis also looked a bit cleaner after a wipe down with some spray and wipe. It seems to work pretty well on slightly tarnished metal surfaces, and while we're in here, I thought I would take a peek inside the power supply, and not much dust had built up. Now it's time for some eucalyptus oil. There's definitely a buildup of gunk on the top casing, plus some small rust spots. I didn't have any paint on hand that matches the grey casing, otherwise I would have touched up the rust as well. Something I can still clean up is the mostly peeled off label. I let some sticker remover sit for a few minutes and it was fairly easy to remove. With all the parts dusted off, I began the reassembly. It wasn't vital that I took this apart, but I was very curious to see the inner workings of such an old PC. Last of all, I used some eucalyptus oil to remove marks on the floppy drive. And here we have the cleaned out Mitac Slim computer. So let's have a bit of fun using it. And here's our battle station, ready for action. My family's first computer ran Windows 3.1, which arguably started my fascination with electronics. And who needs a fancy sound system when you've got MIDI files on a floppy disk, right? The best part is, there are thousands of these songs in MIDI format available for free online. Back before it was called Microsoft Paint, it was called Paintbrush, and I simply couldn't help myself from drawing Clarence from the Big Les Show.
I must say, this is a pretty crude interpretation of me.
Windows looks too normal. Why don't we set the color scheme to hot dog stand? Yes, that's actually what Microsoft called this obnoxious design. And when it comes to games, pretty much anything from the early 90s will run. For example, Wolfenstein 3D by id Software. Another one of my childhood favourites is the original Duke Nukem. This game is shareware and you can get it for free online as well. All of the sounds from these early DOS games are limited to the PC speaker, which is on the motherboard, and I didn't realise this while I was capturing audio from the sound card. Windows 3.1 comes with 3 pre-installed games. Solitaire is one I have fond memories of. I always picked the Tropical Beach deck, as I really wanted to go there as a kid. So there we have it, a neat little relic of the past running great once again. I have a feeling these are pretty rare now, and I'm glad to have one in my collection. Back in 1991, this computer cost around $2,500, which is around $5,000 today adjusted for inflation. And to get to that size, it definitely made some compromises, namely in expandability. But was it worth the compromises to get to that slim size? Honestly, I don't necessarily think so, because a computer like this would have been paired with a very bulky CRT, so it's not exactly like it's going to be a very compact setup to begin with. Anyway, I'm very glad to have it in my collection now, and it is a real oddity from over 30 years ago. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.